Welcome to Mind Shield. We protect the mind and pursue the truth. Let's get started.
Welcome. This presentation is titled The Neural Tether. It examines a disturbing idea that cyber torture is not only an attack on the body or the mind, but a form of forced intimacy. In this framework, the victim is not merely watched. They are held in an invisible relationship, one imposed through intrusion, repetition, and total lack of consent. What makes this model so psychologically devastating is that the attack is framed not as a single event, but as an ongoing connection, a tether, one that blurs surveillance, coercion, addiction, and domination into a single architecture of control. Historically, torture relied on physical proximity: a prison cell, a locked room, restraints, guards, walls. Confinement was visible. But in the present, this presentation argues that proximity has gone digital. The cell no longer needs bars. It can be constructed through persistent intrusion into the nervous system and daily perception of the target. In that model, the body becomes the site of confinement. The victim carries the prison with them. That is what makes the invisible cell so terrifying. There may be no bruises, no chains, no witness, and yet the conditions of captivity remain. This slide lays out the central mechanism of the tether, a claimed two-way loop between perpetrator and victim. On one side, extraction, the harvesting of biometric or neural response. On the other side, injection, auditory, sensory, or physiological disruption aimed back at the target. The deck references patents often cited in these conversations, including remote monitoring concepts and microwave auditory or voice-to-skull claims. Whether one treats these as proof, precursor, or warning sign, the point of the slide is clear. This is framed not as passive observation, but as a closed loop of domination. Not just seeing the victim, but touching their reality from a distance. Here, the presentation shifts from mechanism to motive. It suggests that for the attacker, the victim's distress becomes a feed, a live biometric stream converted into spectacle. Breathing patterns, stress response, eye movement, vocal strain, panic, exhaustion. In this model, pain is not incidental. Pain is the product. And once suffering becomes interactive content, the abuse starts to resemble a binge-driven platform economy. Endless refresh, endless stimulation, endless consumption. The target is no longer treated as a human being with rights and dignity, but as a reactive source, a person reduced to engagement metrics. This slide explores the attacker's reward cycle. The argument here is that the thrill is not only cruelty, it is control. Each successful intrusion, whether auditory harassment, sleep disruption, or induced bodily distress, becomes a psychological reward, a hit, a proof of power. But like any addiction, tolerance builds. The old stimulus stops being enough. So escalation follows. The abuse becomes more frequent, more invasive, more extreme. That escalation is not random. It is the logic of addiction fused with sadism. The attacker chases the fantasy of godlike influence, while the victim absorbs the rising cost. This is one of the most revealing slides in the deck, because it maps two types of domination at once. First, the prison guard is punitive, disciplinary, and obsessed with control through deprivation and punishment. Second, the helicopter parent is intrusive, possessive, unable to tolerate separation, and demanding total access to the target's internal life. Together, they form a grotesque hybrid, an abuser who wants both obedience and intimacy, both fear and dependence. That combination matters. It means the violence is not only about breaking the victim. It is also about colonizing their interior space, their thoughts, routines, reactions, and sense of self. This slide shows the progression. First comes intrusion, the initial disruption, often interpreted as strange voices, sensory interference, or a persistent foreign signal. Then comes exhaustion, sleep loss, stress overload, cognitive erosion. Finally comes monopolization, the target's perception becomes saturated by the attack. Their ordinary reality is crowded out by vigilance, anticipation, and learned helplessness. This is how the tether tightens. Not necessarily through one overwhelming event, but through repetition. By occupying more and more of the victim's attention, the attacker attempts to become the central fact of the victim's consciousness. This is the presentation's most explicit statement of bodily violation. It argues that the attack is experienced across multiple layers: auditory manipulation in the head, autonomic disruption in the chest and nervous system, and even intimate bodily targeting. The underlying idea is brutal. When someone can intrude into the most private zones of perception and physiology, the assault is no longer metaphorical. It violates autonomy at the deepest level. The victim is not simply frightened. They are made to feel that even their own bodies are no longer fully theirs. That is the anatomy of forced intimacy. In total isolation, the victim may be left with one constant presence: the intrusive voice, the manipulative signal, the attacker's imposed rhythm. Under those conditions, the mind may adapt for survival. It may start predicting the abuser, bargaining internally, or organizing daily life around the attack. This slide calls that condition cognitive Stockholm syndrome. Not because the victim consents, and not because the abuse becomes acceptable, but because the nervous system under siege will do almost anything to reduce uncertainty. The tragedy is that adaptation can then be misread from the outside as instability, confusion, or even agreement. Here, the deck splits the experience into two realities. For the perpetrator, the event may feel like a game, a simulation, an experiment, a thrill, or a fantasy of ownership. For the victim, it is none of those things. It is an invisible prison. The motivations are also different. The perpetrator seeks stimulation, domination, and the illusion of omnipotence. The victim seeks only relief, silence, cognitive liberty, and survival. That mismatch is essential. It explains why language often fails. One side experiences entertainment, the other experiences captivity. Same tether, two completely different worlds. This slide turns the tether into a cycle: injection, reaction, extraction, consumption, desensitization, repeat. First, the attacker delivers a stimulus. Then the victim reacts: fear, pain, stress, disorientation. That reaction becomes data. The attacker consumes it, interprets it, and is rewarded. Over time, tolerance builds, so the abuse escalates. The loop then feeds itself. That is why this presentation uses the word parasitic. The system survives by feeding on the victim's nervous system while remaining hidden from ordinary view. It is not a conflict between equals. It is a one-sided harvest. This slide addresses the social weapon that protects the whole structure: disbelief. If the symptoms resemble paranoia, auditory hallucinations, or bizarre claims of invisible interference, society has a ready-made category into which the victim can be dropped. The result is devastating. The very features that make the alleged abuse deniable also make it easy to pathologize. In that sense, psychiatry, when used reflexively rather than forensically, can become cover. Not because mental health care is the enemy, but because lazy interpretation can erase evidence, isolate the victim, and hand the attacker perfect deniability. The mask is insanity. The reality may be systematic abuse. This slide finally turns toward response. For the victim, breaking the tether means reclaiming autonomy, cognitively, physically, and emotionally. The slide mentions shielding, signal disruption, and psychological resilience as part of decoupling from the trauma bond. For society, the task is different but just as urgent: move from reflexive skepticism to disciplined investigation. That means documentation, pattern analysis, expert review, and accountability. If a new class of invisible abuse exists, it will not be solved by mockery, silence, or bureaucratic shrugging. It will be solved by evidence, rigor, and the courage to look where the old categories fail. This final slide delivers the moral core of the presentation. To confront cyber torture, we have to hold two truths at once. First, the perpetrator may be driven by banality, addiction, voyeurism, Entitlement, the intoxication of power. Second, the victim remains fully human, even when the experience sounds unbelievable. That is where empathy becomes a form of resistance. In a digital panopticon, the first casualty is often credibility. So the closing demand is simple but profound. Restore the humanity, dignity, and cognitive liberty of those trapped in the invisible cell. Because without that, the tether wins twice, first in the mind, then in the public record.